Great. It's a real pleasure, Nico. I'll just say a couple of words to introduce you. We know it's very early morning there. We know you've got a busy schedule ahead of you today. We hope you've had breakfast. We're really pleased. We're really pleased that you can join us because you're probably about the only scholar in the world who can connect up two of our major themes, which is the politics of food and the history of Gandhi and the Salt March. So we're really looking forward to your presentation. Most of us will be familiar with your recent work, particularly the book on Gandhi and Salt. And of course, we know of your career at Carnegie Mellon. And we're really looking forward to what you've got to say. We're giving you about 30 minutes, so we'd like to allow some time for Q&A if that's possible.
Well, first, thank you very much, Miles and Tanuja. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you all today and very grateful for this opportunity to share my work and to learn from all of you. I remember vividly when Miles first reached out to me last year with the invitation to come to the UK to participate in a conference. I remember being excited for two reasons. The main one was that there was such a remarkable range of scholars approaching these questions from a variety of perspectives, some of which I had thought about before, many of which I had not looked at it at all, and was and remained very excited to learn from. The other reason, of course, I was excited was because I love coming to the UK. So at some point, we'll have to all get together in person when we get past this pandemic. I am myself right now living in the midst of it. My children's school was just closed because of an outbreak, and so we have them home. I'm sure that it's impacting all of you in your own ways, and I hope that you all are well and that you continue to be well as we move forward. Well, again, thank you very much, Miles and Tanuja. I'm going to try to be brief because I would be very grateful for your feedback and thoughts on the very rough draft that I was able to share with you all. This draft is really a coming together of two big questions that I've grappled with for some time. The first goes all the way back to my dissertation research, which became my first book, and it is really about the links between the struggle against imperialism and caste oppression in colonial India and the struggle against racism in the United States. And when Americans tend to think about these links, they go right away to the connection between Gandhi and Martin Luther King. It's the one relationship that people are familiar with. And my own research really started with the desire to get beyond that, that dyad, to get beyond a sort of great man theory of these sorts of linkages and look at the many other figures that were involved in bridging these struggles, analogizing these struggles, and often confusing them. I started off as a young scholar seeing this as a great story of meaningful solidarities, and I still do. But over time, I became increasingly interested in the misunderstandings and misconnections and missed opportunities that define this history as well. And a lot of that came down to me to the difference between analogizing race and empire and analogizing race and caste. And that's one of the places where I ended up realizing I couldn't really fully dispense with Gandhi. Even though I wanted to displace Gandhi and King as sort of the two stars of the show, I came to realize that Gandhi was too important a figure for this history, and also just too rich and interesting a figure for me to ignore, particularly in regards to his views on race and caste, which many of you will be very familiar with, and I don't want to go into too much detail, even though I find it still very absorbing. The fact that on both fronts, both in terms of his views on race and caste, Gandhi's views changed dramatically over time. I think, in my estimation, his views on race change as much as any other facet of his life. He really goes from being, if not a racist, and I myself wouldn't use that term for him, certainly a racialist who has a strong civilizational view of hierarchy and is willing to use it to advance the cause of Indian migrants in South Africa, to, towards the end of his life, an outspoken opponent of white supremacy and white imperialism, his shift is really quite remarkable. On issues of caste, I think his change is significant, but not as dramatic. And in many ways, even more complicated because, of course, those issues were closer to home for him in a variety of ways. So I've long been interested in how Gandhi's own views on race and caste shifted over time, and in relation to connections to other figures, both within colonial India and elsewhere, particularly African American figures who were challenging not just white supremacy, but also challenging other forms of oppression. The other key question I've been grappling with in regards to Gandhi is, as Miles said, the relationship between his diet and his and every other facet of his life, but especially between his diet and his politics. I looked at this through a variety of different facets of his diet, but of course, salt is one of the places that I started because it's one of the most obvious points of connection between Gandhi's personal diet and his politics, but also one of the most ironic and interesting because, of course, as I discussed in the paper, Gandhi had for years experimented with what he called his saltless diet. He knew very well that it wasn't a saltless diet, that you can't survive without any salt in your diet, but he tried for many years, off and on, for some periods longer than others, to abstain from any additional table salt and to avoid foods like butter that had been purposefully salted. And we can go into why. I expect many of you are already familiar with some of the intricacies of Gandhi's dietary views. In the case of salt, I think the real driving force for him was not concerns about hypertension, sorts of things that medically minded folks might be concerned about today. It had more to do with the impact of salt on flavor and thus on the addictiveness of food. Gandhi was very concerned with food and particularly flavor distracting us from our more important pursuits, which were for him ultimately spiritual, but spiritual via the political. So the goal is to purify one's life through austerity such that one can focus on the spiritual pursuit of truth via the fight for justice. And I explore that through a variety of different foods, but in salt, we have this wonderful irony that on the one hand, for many years, he abstained from salt, at least again, additional salt in his diet, and even across his life, even later in life, maintained quite a bit of skepticism about salt. But yet one of his most famous political campaigns is to increase access to salt, right? And there's a tension there, there's an irony there. And there's also, I thought, perhaps some causality there. Is one facet of his life spilling into the other? Can we say that his interest in the salt tax and the salt march is shaped in part by his lifelong dietary struggles? Or vice versa, could we say that his softening in regards to salt, and he does soften, he does become less austere, less severe, more open, was in part shaped by his recognition of the necessity of salt in the diet, particularly for those who are working long hours in the sun, etc. At least this is how he viewed it. So I have, on the one hand, these issues about how his views on race and caste evolve, and on the other, this interest in his views on salt, which also evolve and connect both his body to his politics. And what this paper allowed me to do for the first time, and I'm grateful for this chance, is to try to bring these things together, try to look at how we might link these different questions in his life. And, starting for me with the fact that they're both examples of tremendous change over time, but then moving from there to look at how these are both very much embodied questions for him, and how these questions are not entirely his to define. So ultimately, what I found most interesting, it's how I started the piece and tried to end it as well. What I found most interesting is the way that Gandhi's embodied politics, or what I call, drawing on the work of others, his integrity, is not entirely his to shape. One of the things I find really interesting about Gandhi, and there's a long literature on this that many of you will be familiar with, is just that his life, as much as any major political figure, is one that was constantly reinterpreted by others. And African Americans constantly reinterpreted him, and I found it quite interesting to do a deeper dive into how African American activists, journalists, thinkers, and others made sense of the Salt Satyagraha and tried to reinterpret it for their own purposes. And I found interesting that some found salt the key question, the key factor, which I think is actually a misinterpretation, both for Gandhi and others. But many did not. Many took the Salt March and the ensuing struggle as an opportunity to reflect on other forms of connection and solidarity, whether based on notions of color, what I call colored cosmopolitanism, colored solidarity, or in terms of nonviolence, the power of nonviolent activism. So ultimately, what I want to argue here is that Gandhi's embodied nationalism, his connection between his own dietary struggles and his conception of the body politic do play out through his relationship to race and caste, and also via his relationship to salt. But that it's not entirely under his control. In fact, the ultimate legacy of that integrity is constantly taken across not just the borders of his own body, but the borders of the nation, the borders of race, reinterpreted and reimagined by others. As I said, it's very much a rough draft. It's my first time trying to bring these different obsessions of my own together. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share it with you all and to benefit from your thoughts, questions, and feedback. Again, Tanuja and Miles, thank you both so much. And thank you all. I look forward to your questions and thoughts.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nico. These are confusions that happen with online working nowadays. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed reading your paper also, especially reading about how Gandhi's salt satyagraha was being perceived in America, and particularly with the way in which in the Black movements, how the kinds of comparisons were being drawn. This is a fantastic opportunity to actually look at, as you do in your work, the kinds of meanings of race and caste that were being drawn, and how salt got drawn into this into these questions. And I'm sure that there are people who have some questions that they would like to ask you. So if you can respond in the chat box or ask questions in the chat box, I'll take it up from there. Yeah, meanwhile, if I can ask a question before, while people sort of type their questions. So you talk about all these experiments in your paper that Gandhi is undertaking about between the pleasure of salt and the kind of austerity that he's trying to evoke in his own self, in his body, as well as the way in which he associates it with the movement. Now I was and I hope my colleague Sanjay is there, because we often talk about this in terms of, like, in the Indian prisons in colonial India, Indian prisons and poorhouses, there's a lot of experimentation that's again happening around diet. Again, this question of, like, how much salt, how much spice, how much sugar, and also about, like, denial of taste or denial of pleasure as a punishment. So how does, because for me this question of violence is coming up again and again when I'm looking at salt and the whole sort of paraphernalia again around it. So how does one counter Gandhi's persistence on non-violence against or not even counter, but how does one sort of look at these two perspectives of how different kinds of experiments around salt are taking place?
That's a wonderfully rich question, Tanuja. Thank you. I've long been fascinated by the way in which Gandhi's view on his own body could, and I think often should, be understood as, at least in part, of a kind of violence. He waged a war on his own instincts, on his own desire for carnal pleasure, for the pleasures of the palate. And although I myself find, as a historian, I find it remarkable how integrated his own views on these issues were. That he thought tremendously about them, and this actually comes to another part of your question there. He's drawing these conceptions of austerity from multiple sources. It's a wonderfully rich example of his own view on sort of transnational nationalism, and that if you want to think about, okay, well, where does this come from for him? Absolutely, a huge part of it comes from indigenous Indian traditions, particularly within Jainism and certain strands of Vaishnavite Hinduism. He gets it from his mother. He gets it from his whole cultural milieu. So it's a profoundly Indian approach to austerity. And yet, it's largely shaped for him within vegetarian communities in London and then in South Africa. And it's hugely influenced by thinkers from all across the world. There's a lot of kind of, as I see it, a sort of flamboyantly wacky American vegetarians that Gandhi's especially interested in. People like Fletcher. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Fletcherizing. It was this whole movement to chew one's food repeatedly, endlessly. And part of that was eliminating flavor. You chew food long enough that it doesn't have any flavor, and then you swallow it. So, Gandhi's drawing from all of these different sources and integrating them in really profound and interesting ways. And I find that very compelling. And yet there's also a part of me that says, but wait, can't you just be a little bit nicer to your own body? I mean, where is all this harshness coming from? And I like the way that you bring in the question of violence and nonviolence. And so one of the things I find endlessly fascinating is how the line there is not clear, I think, right? I mean, if you define violence as inflicting suffering, well, Gandhi's constantly inflicting suffering on himself. And I think that, he has his own very defined conception of what he's doing. And obviously we can't ignore that. For me as a historian, that's my primary job, is to try to understand how he looks at it. And he doesn't look at it that way. But I also think it's important to step back and look at it from other vantage points, particularly given that many of his peers also criticized him for being too obsessive and too strict and too driven in that way. So I think it's a very rich and interesting question. And you're right, it also echoes out when you think about something like the fundamental paradox of nonviolent civil disobedience, which is that it works in part by attracting violence. And this is a long debate within pacifist and nonviolent circles, one that Gandhi grappled with very explicitly. But is it truly an example of nonviolence if a group of marchers, approach assault works, knowing that they're going to be eliciting the violence of the state and taking that upon themselves? You're generating violence. What are you doing there in that situation? So I think those are very rich and interesting questions. I appreciate the way you brought them together. I see there's a bunch of questions now in the chat. Should I jump into some of those?
Yeah, why don't you? Would you like to pick them up from here, or shall I read them out to everyone? I think the chat is available to everyone, right? Yeah. So, Gandhi was aware of the injustice of salt tax quite early on. He writes an article about this in the Vegetarian Journal around 1890. What would be your take on that? And is there any, if we can take it from there.
Absolutely. So I'll be brief and say that fact, and the fact that he keeps coming back to it actually throughout those years. I mean, it's just every few years he'll comment upon it, or he asks at one point a student to research it. That forced me to throw out my first very rough hope for a causal explanation. When I first started looking at these ties, I thought, well, maybe I can argue that the idea of the Salt March comes from his long preoccupations with salt as a dietary force. But if anything, it's the other way around. He's interested in the salt tax and opposed to it, commenting on it, opposing it earlier than he is rejecting salt. When he goes to the UK, you can find lots of examples of him writing about the delights of very salty foods. His first dietary obsession is with vegetarianism, and he embraces that before he becomes especially austere in regards to salt or sugar or any other facet of his life. So, so yeah, Gita, your question's a really important one. And the first thing it does for me is it just makes me say, okay, well, we can't have any clear causal line here between Gandhi's own dietary obsessions and his political interest in salt and the salt tax. It's more complicated. I can just go down the list and read, or Tanuja, you can. I'm happy either way.
Yeah. In fact, to Prashant's question, I would also, he's talking about, the question of a class with diet that becomes, but I would also, for instance, because you do talk about caste in your paper, so the question of caste that comes up. So if you could, solidarity as not just as a class, mark of class distinction, but also of caste distinction.
Yes, and here again, I would say that I don't know if this happens to all of you, I don't know that it's a mark of a good scholar. It probably isn't, but I often start my research looking for clear causal ties, and then I end up realizing, the research, the data, the evidence, the sources just don't hold up to it. And here's another example of this where I thought, well, one could argue that that salt is another example, and there are others, in which Gandhi's own politics and philosophy are shaped by the people that he's supposed to be leading, right? I mean, in the very oversimplified narrative that none of us here would hold, right? Gandhi is the leader who comes to the people and says, this is how we should think and do and act and move forward. Whereas there's an argument that it's through his engagement with struggles in Bihar, but also in other parts of India, that he is forced to recognize the intense perniciousness of the salt tax. But it's more complicated than that. It is, absolutely. And so I think Prashant, but first of all, I wasn't aware of this, and this I'm going to have to look more into the way that it figures into middle class discourse as a mark of class distinction. I'd like to know more about that. But of course, I'm not surprised by that. And I do think that Gandhi's own views on diet, he frames it very much as an effort to connect with the poor, right? I mean, he says that repeatedly again and again, that he's trying to enact in his own diet a form of solidarity with the poorest. And he sees it as almost like an effort of public policy. He's going to experiment for himself with how to wrest the greatest amounts of nutrients from the simplest diet, so that could then be brought to the villagers and could be used to support them. But there is in that approach the sort of paternalism that Gandhi brings to many other questions, particularly caste, and I think he deserves all the criticism that he's received in that regard. If you look at even just the name Harijan, for example. So I think there is something of a paternalistic middle class approach to issues of class and caste in how Gandhi thinks about salt and nutrition. And I appreciate Prashant's question on that front.
There's a question of whether Gandhi was aware of research into goiter and public health initiatives in Switzerland and USA, which involved fortifying salt with iodine to combat goiter, and if so, what were his views on it?
I don't believe he was, but if anyone finds evidence of it, I would like to know. I had a whole little section on my book on diet about iodine and efforts to add it to salt, which I find it's a fascinating history of public policy, and I wanted to work it into the book, so I had it kind of ready to go, and then I tried to look through Gandhi's collected works and other sources to see, does it come up? Is he aware of it? Is he drawing those links? And I couldn't find it. But if anyone else does, I would be delighted to know.
Yeah, thank you. And there's this other question from Niranjana Ramesh. How did this complex relationship of the Gandhian almost precocious body to salt, as well as colonial taxes on it, influence other coastal industries that depended on salt? For example, preparing salt fish, or just preservation cultures in general. If you have.
That's a fabulous question, and another one that I haven't been able to look at myself. But I think one of the most interesting things about salt from a dietary perspective is that it's not just something we consume for nutritional or often more, gustatory purposes. It's also can be a very important preservation technique in many cultures. And I haven't seen Gandhi acknowledging that or recognizing that or engaging it. But it would be interesting if he did, and even if he didn't, it's interesting to think about the use of salt as a preservation technique and what that means, not just for practical terms, but also as a symbol, right? I mean, one of the things I found interesting in the research I did was just how, as Gandhi's views on salt shift over time, we see that not just in regards to his own diet and the letters that he sends to his friends and colleagues and family members about salt. He becomes more open to salt and less severe, but he also starts to use salt as an analogy, very frequently, actually, to talk about, Indians being true to their own salt, true to the salt of the land. There's some biblical references in there, and yet I haven't seen a lot of references to salt as a preservation strategy or technique. And I would think it actually quite fascinating. So I appreciate that question as well.
Yeah. There's a question it's from Luna. The issue is that we're not circulating papers to anyone beyond the presenters at this moment, because they are slotted to be published later on as a special journal volume. And at that point of time, they would become available. At this point of time, they are barely rough drafts, which we cannot circulate. But maybe perhaps Nico can, as a closing remark, maybe talk a little bit more about, if you could talk a little bit more about your paper, so that other people also get a sense of the wide range of issues actually that you're talking about in your paper.
I would be delighted to, and I'll try to be brief because I know Miles, you haven't yet shared yours, and I'm excited to hear it. So I read both the introductory pieces that Miles and Tanuja shared, and it struck me again just how exciting this collaborative, we can call it, is. That there's so many different questions that arise when we think with and through salt. And I'm really delighted to be here with you all. So yes, Luna, thank you for the opportunity to come back to the sort of central preoccupations of the paper. So as I said at the outset, there's really two issues here as I see them. The relationship between Gandhi and salt, which is a kind of bifurcated question. On the one hand, there's his own dietary obsessions with salt, which are really about restricting, abstaining, avoiding salt. And then there's the political question related to the salt tax, and then eventually the salt march and salt satyagraha, which, as I expect most of you know, doesn't end with the salt march, right? Because at least, the African-American press, as some papers like the Chicago Defender suggest, that this is an unqualified victory. But of course, the colonial state is very cagey and, reintroduces elements of the salt tax in different places. And it's an ongoing struggle. And even at the moment of independence, it's very unclear what's going to happen with it. And then, as I think it was Miles, and I can't remember who, either Tanuja or Miles, maybe both of you talk about in your papers, it goes beyond independence. It's an ongoing issue. So, there's that element to the paper. The other part I didn't talk that much about, and maybe I can just say very briefly, is this issue of the relationship between Gandhi's diet and his views on race. This is something I've written about more in regards to other dietary issues for Gandhi. There's a really fascinating episode in Gandhi's time in South Africa, in regards to a black a food that is associated with black South African communities called mealie pap. It's a corn-based breakfast food that Gandhi at first rejects completely in strongly racialized terms. And when he's imprisoned, says, we refuse to eat this food. It's not Indian food, etc. It really reveals his racialized conception of civilizational hierarchy. But very quickly, he goes to the other end of the extreme and decides that his views on mealy pap are 180 degrees wrong, that in fact it's a life-giving, strength-giving food that Indians should embrace. And what I argue is that this shift in regards to mealy pap is happening at the same time and is really bound up with a larger shift in Gandhi's views on race and on potential solidarities with Black South Africans, and that we shouldn't entirely discount actually the causative dimension of Gandhi's obsessions with diet. You know, one could easily suggest that it's really the politics that shift for him, and then the diet follows. You know, that he develops a stronger sense of solidarity with Black peoples in South Africa and elsewhere, and then he changes his mind on mealy pap. But I think looking at it more closely, you see that these things are very much bound up for him. And that food actually is one of the key driving forces for Gandhi's cosmopolitanism, and particularly his racial cosmopolitanism, that he has this long correspondence with African-American scientist George Washington Carver, which is really driven by dietary concerns. Carver tries to help Gandhi develop a vegan alternative to milk. So what you find, at least what I find, is that his views on race and caste in different ways are evolving in part in response to his dietary struggles. And salt, this paper was my first effort to really bring salt and his struggles with salt into that other larger story of Gandhi's embodied, what we can call it integrity, or if we want to go from a different angle, his nationalism, and way in which his dietary obsessions play out in regards to his politics, in particular in regards to his views on race and caste. As you can see, it's hard for me to be succinct. I think that's a sign both of the fact that it's still new for me to try to bring all this together, but also I think it's a testament to just how rich this history was for Gandhi and beyond. So thank you again to Nuja and Miles, and thank you all of you. It's a real opportunity to learn from you all, and I look forward to continuing to do so in the months ahead.
Thank you so much, Nico. And I must compliment you on the artwork on your wall.
Thank you. I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, so we have lots and lots of beautiful art to share.
Yes, thank you so much. With this, I'd like to invite Miles. Professor Miles Taylor has been the driving force behind this seminar. We were supposed to have met in London, as Nico says, and we were all looking forward to it. But because of the pandemic, we are talking across borders over internet wavelengths. In some senses, this has allowed actually a lot of people to join us from across the world. Right now, there are people from across the world who are connected to this seminar.